A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon 1000 Shabbos at the Skitzar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to become mussar.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide, Yehuda Geber.
Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode about Rav Naftali Trop, the Radin Yeshiva, is dedicated by the Einiklach of Rav Naftali Zechrani Levrocha as a schus for a Gemar Chasima Taiva for the entire Mishpacha and Gans Klal Yisrael. So the story of Rav Naftali Trop is a great story about the Radin Yeshiva and his life and who he was as a person. Before that, I just got a little bit about the feedback and some other news and tidbits. Interestingly enough, last episode, some of the great feedback I got from listeners was about the dedication from last episode about the Aleph Beta. Many listeners followed my recommendation and to go to alephbeta.org and for their great content, to check it out, to get it before Yom Kippur and Sukkot, and there's loads of great content, especially these coming weeks, and animated Torah videos and all kinds of looking at the Torah's texts and making them meaningful and relevant in our lives today. So check out Aleph Beta. Either way, getting back to Rav Naftali Trop, it's his yard site. That's why we're doing it. It's the Tzom Gedalia, the third day of the month of Tishrei was the day of the passing of Naftali. He passed away on Motzei Rosh Hashanah. It's interesting. There was in the good old days, the early days of the Hasidic movement, when it was much more radical, and before it became very traditionalist in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So there was a certain of the early tzaddikim, Chayzer, a couple other ones. They had this thing about not fasting on Tzom Gedalia anymore. I saw some fascinating sources about it, and maybe we should get that started going again. Either way, you definitely want to check out the For the Record column in this week's Mishpacha magazine, the Yom Kippur edition. My collaborator and dear colleague Davi Safir and I have written up one of our best ones yet about Baruch Ber Leibovich, the Kamenetz Rosh Yeshiva who was in the United States for Yom Kippur in 1928, I believe. I don't even remember what year it was. I would have to check the column myself. And he was in Newark, and Rav Yosef Konvitz was the Rav there, and there's some interesting tidbits about him as well. So you want to check that out. Also, keep your eyes open for the legendary Mishpacha magazine Sukkot edition, which is going to come out before Sukkot, obviously. And there's going to be some exciting stuff that Davi and I have worked on, and details to come. Stay tuned. Also, just around the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur time, I saw a great article on Professor David Asaf's blog. Someone else posted it. About the piyut which we recite on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, Melech Elyon, and there's this one insert that we say of Melech Evyon, which refers to a earthly or human king and the feebles and the limitations of a human king, as opposed to the greatness of the King of Kings, God Himself. So there was this fascinating historical article where the original piyut was authored as the refrain of Melech Evyain followed every single stanza of Melech Elyain, and it was self-censored out over history, and it was self-censored out because the understanding of the printers was that it would seem derogatory to the local monarch, whoever it may be at that time, that you're referring to him as this Melech Evyain and writing all kinds of derogatory limitations that a human king has as opposed to God. So it was self-censored out, and most of the piyut disappeared, which I found fascinating also. So when you hear the history behind these piyutim we recite, it makes it more interesting as well. But finally, getting back to Rav Naftali Trop, that's the subject of today, and there's all kinds of sources that give us tidbits about his life. There's the introduction to his Chidushei Hagranat, Rav Naftali Trop. There's all kinds of other books that brings stuff in passing. Making of a Gadol has some nice stories about him. I believe that Rav Naftali deserves more. There's very sparse sources. The introduction that I mentioned, the introduction to his Sefer, which brings the short biography of his life, I felt was pretty lousy. There was lots of mistakes, and there's only passing references to him in the biography on the Chavetz Chaim and Rabbi Moshe Landinsky and Rabbi Yerucham and other books. I think more needs to be written on him. On our trips to Radin, we see the yeshiva building, which is still intact, and his and also Rav Naftali's restored grave in the cemetery near the Chavetz Chaim and Rabbi Moshe Landinsky, the other Radin Yeshiva. Though we tend to get overwhelmed by the Chavetz Chaim on the visits to Radin, I always try to devote a few minutes to Rav Naftali Trop. I think he's a fascinating story and a great one, and also the others in Radin. I try not to make it just about the Chavetz Chaim. I also even bring the groups to the mass grave of the Radin townspeople killed in the Holocaust, which is in the cemetery as well. So let's talk a little bit about Rav Naftali. Though I generally refrain from preaching any Torah thoughts on this platform, which is a history podcast, since it's very timely, again, about the days of awe that we're in the midst of at this current time, I'll take an exception and share a thought of Rav Naftali Trop on the Slichas, which we recite currently every morning during this time of year. We repeat the refrain in the introduction to the Slichas that it's Kedalim u'kerashim dafaknu d'lasecha, like poor people, we come knocking on your door, knocking on heaven's door, as it were. So why do we repeat it? We say it twice, almost one sentence after the other. So Rav Naftali Trop explained that usually when a poor person who is schnorring for some money and food, he knocks on the door. If no one answers, he moves on to the next house. But when the poor fellow is starving and desperate, so out of desperation, he's not going to move on to the next home so easily. He's going to knock and knock until someone answers the door and has mercy on him. And that's what we're trying to emphasize when we're coming before God during this time, is that we're kedalim u'kerashim, that we're poor and we're just going to knock and knock again and keep on knocking until we're able to be, get our salvation. So Rav Naftali Trop was born in Grodno and studied by his father Rav Moshe until he went on to yeshiva. He studied in Kelm by the altar of Kelm. He went on to Telz, where he was a student of Reb Eliezer Gordon. He then moved on to Slabodka, which was one of the main places where he was a student. It was of the altar of Slabodka. He also had a relationship with Navardik at one point, but he was a very close student of the altar of Slabodka, and also of the Rosh Yeshiva there, Reb Itzel Aponovizher, who Reb Itzel Rabinovich, who was later Reb Itzel Aponovizher. Then he was still a Rebbe. He was a teacher in the Slabodka Yeshiva, and that had a decisive impact on the style of Derech Halimud, of the way Reb Naftali taught Torah to his students, was very much formed, had an impact by Reb Itzel Aponovizher. He was so close with the altar of Slabodka that he was engaged to be married to the altar's daughter. The altar of Nassif the altar of Slabodka, his daughter, was engaged to Rav Naftali, possibly even married. Until today, it's unclear, and there seems to be a dispute among the sources if he was just engaged or he was actually married. What we know for sure happened was that unfortunately this young lady passed away quite suddenly at a very young age, and nothing came of that. So either it was terminated during the engagement because of her untimely passing, or it was shortly after they had already gotten married, and then she passed away. It was very tragic either way. It was very sad. I personally tend to believe that it was just an engagement, and that's from a sense of the silence of the sources. I feel like a marriage makes more noise. There's invitations, there's a big event, there's people who go, there's many people who attend, there's documentation, there's a ksuba, there's all kinds of other documents that float around. In other words, there would have been a much more richness of a source material to have found had an actual marriage taken place. And the fact that there's a dearth of such sources, either eyewitnesses or people who attended or documentation or anything like that, would lead me to believe that it was just an engagement. But I could be wrong, obviously, and it's definitely disputed until today. Either way, it's tragic either way, and definitely it doesn't make it less of a tragedy if it was only an engagement. So he eventually goes on to marry the daughter of Eliezer Yaakov Chavas, or Eliezer Chavas, he was called. And I'm going to get back to him and Rav Naftali's marriage and his children later on. I want to move back to just the trajectory of his biography. So following his marriage, he goes back to Kelm. He returns to Kelm to keep on studying for another several years, and eventually is appointed the Rosh Yeshiva of the Or HaChaim Yeshiva for younger students in Slabodka, who the founder of that yeshiva was Reb Tzvi Hirsch Levitan, very interesting individual as well. And this Or HaChaim Yeshiva was for younger students. It was not the famous Slabodka Yeshiva of the Alter, which was for older students. And Rav Naftali is the Rosh Yeshiva there for several years, until he reaches where he's going to remain for the rest of his life, the Radin Yeshiva. He's hired by the Chofetz Chaim in 1904, and he remains there for the next quarter of a century until his own passing. And he raises the yeshiva to a new level. He brings the new derech halimud to the yeshiva, and the reason the Chofetz Chaim brings him into the yeshiva is that he should infuse the yeshiva with a new life. Radin was a bit old school up until that point, and all the other yeshivas around were modernizing themselves in the sense of the style of learning that was prevalent in that yeshiva, in each yeshiva, because Reb Chaim Brisker in Volozhin had revolutionized the world of Talmudic study with his new way of analytical thinking and teaching. And Rav Naftali, though he had never studied by Reb Chaim Brisker, but he had a similar style of learning, and it electrified the youth. It was dynamic, and he was charismatic, and he was a fantastic Maggid Shir, and he was going to be someone who would revitalize the learning and attract the higher level of students to Radin, which was very needed at the time. And it was, infused with youth. He was in his 30s, and it would bring a new life to the yeshiva, which it did. And the reason the Radin became a successful and top-notch yeshiva after that was completely due. Anything that did accomplish, never became a first-tier yeshiva like some of the others at the time. But whatever it was able to be, its impact can be almost exclusively assigned to Reb Naftali's being in the yeshiva. So it put Radin on the map, and he also brought the mussar movement there. He was a product of Slabodka and Kelm, and Radin was not a mussar yeshiva until that point. And Reb Naftali, even though he was brought in as a capacity as a lamdan, as a Rosh Yeshiva, he also brought in the mussar movement as well. Interesting is because there was already a Rosh Yeshiva in Radin. Reb Moshe Landinsky, who had studied in Volozhin, was a tremendous Talmud Chacham, and he was the Rosh Yeshiva. He was older, much older, and also old school in the way his style of learning and teaching. And there was some friction. They were bringing in this new young guy who was kind of almost like replacing him, or at least some sort of competition with him. So the greatness of Rav Moshe Landinsky is that he allowed it. The Chofetz Chaim spoke to him beforehand, and he promised him that he would outlive them all, and the yeshiva would one day be his. And that caused a bit of controversy in the late 1930s in Radin, which is another story. But Rav Moshe Landinsky did outlive everyone else, and with the blessing of the Chofetz Chaim and his greatness of stepping aside, as it were, and being out of the spotlight, being out of the limelight, and letting this new younger kid on the block, so to speak, Rav Naftali, to take the central stage where this senior Rosh Yeshiva, who had been there for many years, was much older, and a great, great Talmud Chacham, and it was in his humility and his modesty and his greatness that he was able to work this out, and the two were able to hold each other in high esteem. And he also wasn't excited about Rav Naftali bringing in the mussar idea into the yeshiva. He was an old school Volozhiner, which didn't see the necessity of incorporating the mussar movement's ideals into the curriculum of the yeshiva. So there's all this friction under the surface, but yet somehow they do manage to get along, as great people do. Rav Naftali was very close with the Chavetz Chaim and held him in tremendously high esteem. It's a funny and interesting story. One time a student came to the Chavetz Chaim and asked him, where is he to kindle the Hanukkah candles? Which places? Where he eats, or in his stanzia, where he sleeps? And the Chavetz Chaim referred to him to Rav Naftali. He said, why don't you go ask Rav Naftali the question? And when he came to Rav Naftali said to him, let's study the relevant topic in the Mishnah Brura, which is authored by the Chavetz Chaim, and all problems will be solved. We'll see how he decides the question. The Chavetz Chaim would actually attend the shiurim of Rav Naftali. And I heard Rebbe Wine once told me a story that Rav Naftali was the what we call the Welt Lamden. He was a tremendous. He was one of that's why they brought him to Radin. He was the Lumdish. His style of learning was very deep and very analytical and very, the Chakira, he utilized it, and the Chavetz Chaim used to sit in the back when Rav Naftali would deliver his Torah classes and to the yeshiva. And one time Rav Naftali delivered a shir, and he said an approach to the sugya, to the Talmudic topic at hand, and then he said, we can say even deeper. And he brought in a different approach. And then when he was finished with that, he said, we can say it even deeper. And from the back, the Chavetz Chaim said, Rav Naftali, the ways of the Torah are pleasant, and you're making it too deep for everyone, and we're going to lose you. And he had him stop and not say the third approach. But once we're talking about three approaches, Rav Naftali Trop from his Kelm days was very close friends, dear, lifelong friends with Rabbi Yerucham Levovitz, the great Mashgiach of the Mir. And in fact, Rabbi Yerucham Levovitz was the Mashgiach in Radin for several years when Rav Naftali was the Rosh Yeshiva, and they were together leading the Yeshiva of Radin. And when they were in Kelm together, they used to study. They were study partners. And Rabbi Yerucham once was studying with him, and they had a question. They were studying a question of the Rashba, Rabbi Shlomo ibn Aderes, one of the great early Rishonim, later Rishonim actually. And Rabbi Yerucham said, they study the question. And then Rav Naftali says, okay, let me think of what the Rashba's answer is. And Rav Naftali thought for a few minutes and said, I think this is going to be the Rashba's answer. And Rabbi Yerucham said, try again. And Rav Naftali said, okay. And he thought a few more minutes, and he said a second approach. And Rabbi Yerucham says, try again. And Rav Naftali says, what? It can't be. And he thinks again, and another few minutes, and he says, this is a third approach. This has to be what the Rashba is going to say. And then Rabbi Yerucham opened up the Rashba and showed Rav Naftali that all three answers were three answers of the Rashba, and Rabbi Yerucham pointed out the brilliance of Rav Naftali, that he had completely mastered the approach of the Rashba, that he was able to think of all three answers of the Rashba. They even had a dream of having a yeshiva together, which was kind of the Radin stint of Rabbi Yerucham fulfilled that dream. And they said in Kelm at the time, is nit given klar wer wird sein der Rosh Yeshiva and wer wird sein der Mashgiach. It wasn't clear who would be the Rosh Yeshiva and which one would be the Mashgiach. And we think of Rabbi Yerucham as the quintessential Mashgiach, and we think of Rav Naftali Trop as the quintessential Rosh Yeshiva, and yet in Kelm it wasn't clear who would be which at that time. Rav Naftali, who had essentially instituted the Mussar Seder in Radin, attended the Mussar Seder each day, and he even delivered Mr. Shmuzin in the yeshiva for a time as well. Rav Naftali had never studied in Volozhin. He had never studied in Brisk. He had never been a student of Reb Chaim Brisker, and yet he somehow had it. He had the Derech Halimud. He had the approach of learning of Reb Chaim Brisker. Perhaps it was on his own. Perhaps it was the impact. Perhaps it was in the impact of Reb Itzel Rabinovich, the future Reb Itzel Aponovizher, who was his teacher in Slabodka. But he had it. And that's what he gave over, and that's what made him essentially so popular. So I mentioned that he had been engaged to the Alter of Slabodka's daughter, maybe even married. Still unclear so many years later. But he eventually marries the great activist Rebbe Eliezer Yankov Chavas's daughter. His daughter, her name was either Pesia Leah or Pesha Leah. Different sources bring it different ways, either Pesia or Pesha. The name Pesia probably comes from Basia, the daughter of God, the Hebrew name, and it was a Yiddishized version of Basia was Pesia or Pesha. Basha, Pesia, it goes into different variants. So it seems that Pesia and Pesha are two versions of the same name. My guess is that in Lithuanian-style Yiddish, it was pronounced Pesia, and in Polish or Russian Yiddish, it was pronounced Pesha. So that's just my personal guess. Otherwise, I can't figure out why it was either Pesia or Pesha. Either way, so that was his wife's name, Peshileah. So he, Rebbe Eliezer Chavas was a tremendous activist. He had a large role in establishing the relationship with the famous Berlin philanthropist Emil or Ovadia Lachman, whose support for Telz Yeshiva and Slabodka Yeshiva, and especially the Rebbe Eliezer Chavas was the agent that got Lachman involved in the funding for the Kovna Koil, which got it off the ground. He made that arrangement. So he lived in Yanushuk, and that's where Rav Naftali settles down after his marriage. And unfortunately, his wife passed away at quite a young age from typhus in 1920, when they were still in exile in Russia during World War I, or right after World War I, rather. And Rav Naftali, during his years in Radin, produces some very famous students. There's Rabbi Yitzchak Meir Pachiner, who later becomes Ben Menachem, who was the son-in-law of Rabbi Saul Meltzer, Rabbi Shlomo Hyman, Rabbi David Dryan, who was later in England, Rabbi Yaakov Moshe Shurkin, Rabbi Eli Dushnitzer, the Panovich Rav, Rabbi Shlomo Kahana, and many, many more. He was like a father to his students. He was very passionate. He exerted tremendous efforts in preparing his shiurim. He was the father of the Chakira, like I said, that style of teaching, of learning, of taking apart the sugya of the Gemara. He was very clear in his shiurim, and he would study personally a chavrusa, study partnership with many of his students, personally, with them. He would offer, he would go over, he would initiate this. And one of them once said to him, I don't really have time to study with the Rosh Yeshiva. So, which is amazing how he said that. Rav Naftali said, how about early in the morning? Can we study then? So this same student said, well, it's difficult for me to wake up early in the morning. So Rav Naftali said, no problem. Tell me where your stanzia is, where you sleep. I'll wake you up. And so he did. And they studied together. Reb David Zaritsky, who was a student of Radin and later a famous author and writer, he once saw a fellow student crying at the grave of Rav Naftali Trop 2 years after his passing. Not the next day, 2 years after his passing. And Reb David Zaritsky said, I can't imagine a son crying by his father's grave the way that student cried by Reb Naftali's grave. That was the relationship that he had with his students even so long after his passing. One of the unique things about Rav Naftali Trop and his personality was the rare combination of the ultimate Rosh Yeshiva teacher of Torah, Lamdin, and at the same time a leading Baal Mussar, someone who was legendary in his actions and care for others. He would host people in his home. He was very famous for his Achnas Zarchim, for having guests in his home. He was well known as a leading host who would welcome anyone into his home. Once a local thief was treated well as his guest and was able to stay there safely, because Rav Naftali said that one is still required to treat him well, even though he's a thief, and to serve him as a guest. The obligation of Achnas Zarchim is applicable to this individual as well. Just because he's a thief, is he not a Jew? Is he not a human being who deserves to be treated with dignity? And that's the type of person he was. And one time Rav Naftali's daughter related that she had turned down a guest because there was no room in the house, so she gave the guest some money to this wayfarer to stay in a local motel. When Rav Naftali found out what she did, he said, why didn't you go to the hotel? So he said to his daughter, he said, the reason is because you feel that this is your home. So let me tell you something. This is just as much the home of the poor wanderer as well as just as much as it's your home. He and his wife would also regularly visit the local hospital to feed patients and ensure their needs were cared for, even in wards with contagious diseases. And this is at a time that he was preparing his legendary shiurim and maintained a personal relationship with his many students. He was somehow able to make time for everything which he saw as a priority. Once there was a solar eclipse in Radin and everyone went to see it. Rav Naftali stood by a cherry tree near the Radin Yeshiva, gazing at the eclipse through some sort of gazing device. I wasn't able to figure out what it was, and he remarked to those around him, he was very impressed with the solar eclipse, so he remarked to those around him, "Men darf nit gucken, men darf sehen." You can't just look. You have to gaze at it. You have to see it. You have to. In other words, he applied his lumdish way of looking at things. That's how you have to look at a solar eclipse as well. You have to, really, appreciate the solar eclipse. Rav Naftali also delivered a weekly Friday night chumash here in the great synagogue of Radin to the local lay people of Radin. Nothing to do with the yeshiva, which was quite popular, and he obviously did this on a voluntary basis. He accompanied the Radin Yeshiva into its exile during World War I to Shmilovitz, Shumiat, Snovsk, and his wife passed away, like I mentioned, while they were still in exile, and his health deteriorated following her passing. When Rav Naftali was sick in his later years, his final illness with a fatal muscular disorder, which would eventually take his life, there were passionate prayers on his behalf in the yeshiva. The Chavetz Chaim himself even offered his own years to extend Rav Naftali's life, which was an accepted mystical formula that was done occasionally under those circumstances. But alas, it was to no avail. Rav Naftali passed away in 1928 at the relatively young age of 57 on Motzei Rosh Hashanah, now on the third day of Tishrei, Tzem Gedalia. The Radin Yeshiva never really recovered its former glory after his passing. He had been the primary attraction for top students, and it never regained that prestige. Rabbi Zalman Meltzer was visiting from Palestine for the Kletsk Yeshiva building dedication at that time, and he was offered a position in Radin to replace Rav Naftali after his passing. He declined, he turned it down, he returned to Palestine. There was a whole issue in Radin afterwards about Rav Naftali's family and the Radin Yeshiva. A lot of politics. There was some disputes about which one of his children would replace him, would come into his place, and there's a whole story of the last decade of the Radin Yeshiva, and all the everything that was going on there. There's quite a bit going on, which I'm not going to get into too much now. I just want to mention his children because they were the ones. Some of them were the ones who replaced him. So I'm just going to give a short summary of who Reb Naftali's family was. Two children did somewhat fill his place in the yeshiva. Rav Trop and Reb Baruch Feivelson, a son and son-in-law, both had nominal and something between unofficial and official positions in the yeshiva. Because there's the Chavetz Chaim's family, the Zaxes, and the Londinsky family. They also had claims, so things got complicated after a while. But Rav Trop, who was the oldest child, he married the daughter of a great Lithuanian rabbi, Rabbi Yaakov Moshe Sapir. His wife's name, Rav Trop's wife's name was Esther Sapir, and his brother-in-law, Rav Trop's brother-in-law, in other words, his wife's sister, had married Rabbi Shua Levinson, who was the grandson of the Chavetz Chaim, son of Reb Hirsch Levinson, and ran the yeshiva after his father Reb Hirsch's passing. So there he had an in with the yeshiva administration, right, with his family connection. Rav Trop was very close with the Chavetz Chaim. He learned in Radin, so he had this quasi-official position in Radin Yeshiva and remained there until the war broke out. And following the Soviet takeover of the area, he was arrested and deported to Siberia. He ended up in Samarkand in Uzbekistan, where he survived the war. He immigrated to the United States, and he eventually was he was a part of for a time with Rebendel Zaks, the Chavetz Chaim, in New York, but he was eventually the Reshiva of the Karlin Stalin Yeshiva in the 1960s, and at the end of his life, he immigrated to Israel and passed away there in 1978. He had two daughters. One married Reb Henoch Leibowitz, which is a nice irony. You get Reb Henoch Leibowitz was the Reshiva of Chavetz Chaim Yeshiva, which is a different yeshiva. Obviously, Reb David Leibowitz, his father, was a family related, a nephew of the Chavetz Chaim, and a close student of his. So it was the Yeshiva Chavetz Chaim. So here you had the Rosh Yeshiva of the Yeshiva Chavetz Chaim marrying a Trop, who was from the Radin Yeshiva in Europe. So it's a nice connection. And then the second daughter, they of course unfortunately never had children. The second daughter married Reb Chaim Portnoy, who was in Altamir, who studied in the Mir Yeshiva. He was from Brisk, grew up in Brisk, then studied in the Mir. So he was Brisk Mir Radin, which is not bad for Litvish credentials. You pretty much can't get better than that. It's like someone saying that he went to Stuyvesant High and then Harvard and then got a faculty position at Cornell. So that's pretty good. So the Portnoy family today are prominent descendants of Rav Naftali Trop, a prominent family. There was another Altamir, Reb Lezer Portnoy, who was in the Mir and instrumental in obtaining the famous Sugihara visas. So it's a prominent family. Another son of Rav Naftali was Reb Ruvain Trop. He studied in Radin. He also studied in Vij, which was the first yeshiva of the future Panovizher Rav. He also was a student of the Mir Yeshiva. And then in 1925, he went to Palestine, where he studied in Hebron, to study in the Slabodka Yeshiva, which had reestablished in Hebron. He survived the massacre, and then he married and settled down in Yerushalayim, where he held various positions in the Hebron Yeshiva. And then he was later a rabbi in Tel Aviv, and when he lived in Tel Aviv, he was appointed by the rabbi of Tel Aviv, Rav Moshe Avigdor Amiel, as the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat HaYishuv HaChadash. Unfortunately, because of his deteriorating health, that position was eventually retained by Rabbi Yehuda Kolodetsky, and Rav Reuven Trop passed away at the young age of 50 in 1951. Several of his grandchildren hold prominent positions in the religious Zionist community today, including a current Knesset member, Michal Waldiger, who's currently in the Knesset. She's a descendant of Rav Naftali Trop. There was another child of Rav Naftali, a daughter, Toibe, who married a Radin student named Rabbi Yeshua Isaac Kamenetsky. He was a rabbi of a town in Poland, and unfortunately the entire family was wiped out in the Holocaust. And then the youngest daughter, her name was Fege Etel. She married Reb Baruch Yosef Feivelson, who nominally took over his father-in-law's position in the yeshiva following his passing, until his untimely passing just a couple of years later, in 1933, when he was only 38 years old. And we visit his grave next to his father-in-law, next to Rav Naftali, in Radin. He's in the same row, Reb Baruch Feivelson. He's actually the only one in that whole row that the original tombstone was found, so it's more authentic. It gives a more authentic feel. It's the actual tombstone of Reb Baruch Feivelson. He was from a very prominent Lithuanian rabbinic family, and his father, Reb Eliyahu Meir Feivelson, was one of the most famous and active rabbinic and yeshiva leaders of his day. Reb Baruch Feivelson himself studied in the Slabodka Yeshiva and was quite talented despite his youth, and he was appointed in his father-in-law's stead and passed away tragically shortly thereafter. It was also only a few weeks prior to the Chavetz Chaim's own passing, so that was a rough summer for the Radin Yeshiva. Reb Baruch Feivelson's wife and children were exiled to Siberia during the war. The mother passed away, and then one of the children died shortly after the war. But the remaining children, who were young, they eventually made it to Israel. They were prominent in Israel after the war, and their families are still in Israel today. So that's Rav Naftali Trop. This is Yehuda Geberer of Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageberer.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on Podbean or your favorite podcast platform. Follow us on Twitter at JSoundbites, and I hope you enjoyed.